Don't threaten it if you're not going to do it. All right, chapter 49.
Back to the blessings.
And we finished up with the study of the tribe of Judah. Now, beginning in verse 13, Jacob discusses Zebulun and Issachar. Now, I don't know if any of you noticed this or not, but for the most part, he has begun with Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, in birth order of those first four. With these last two of Leah's kids, they're not in birth order.
So he stayed with Leah before going to another wife?
Yep, he did all 6 kids of Leah, but the last 2 he reverses. Issachar was actually the older between Issachar and Zebulun. You'll recall that Leah went several years in between kid number 4 and number 5. And again, when I'm saying that, we're talking boys here. We don't know how many girls she had. We know by name of one, but clearly there were others. We just don't know how many. But apparently we are told that she went for a period of time in between Judah and giving birth to Issachar. But these last 2, as I said, Jacob reverses the order. Leah's youngest is Zebulun, but that's the one Jacob covers in verse 13. It says, Zebulun shall dwell at the seashore, and he shall be a haven for ships, and his flank shall be toward Sidon. This is the only one of the Israelite tribes that inherited a port. Because what was to the south of there, now, there were others that could have had ports if they'd have conquered the Philistines as they were told to, but they didn't. To the south of the tribe of Zebulun is where the Philistine stronghold was, what we now today call the Gaza Strip. They never did conquer that area. I mean, they did get control of it under King David's reign, but even under his reign, they did not exterminate the Philistines. They continued living there. They were just under subjection. But Zebulun is the only one of the 12 tribes that actually inherited an area of land that was on the Mediterranean coast, and they were sandwiched in between, the Gaza Strip or the land of the Philistines to the south. And anybody remember what was to the north of them? Today it would be Lebanon, but obviously Lebanon didn't exist then.
Oh, that was that King Hebron or whatever?
You're on the right track. That was the area of Tyre.
Is that the Hittites?
No, Hittites were an entire empire, but they had been, except for a few select people here and there, the Hittite Empire was long gone by this point. And the Hittite Empire was to the north of there in what today is modern Turkey.
So they were further north.
Oh yeah,
Okay,
way
I
north.
thought they extended down almost to the Lebanon area.
A few here
But
and
that
there.
was that was a prior era.
Yeah.
Okay.
But no, Tyre was what was to the north of there. Now, you'll notice it says, Zebulun shall dwell at the seashore. So he prophesied that Zebulun would be the one to inherit the area along the Mediterranean Sea. And they actually had ports and what have you with the dual kingdom of Tyre and Sidon to the north. But then after that, he mentions in verse 14 Issachar, which again is interesting because Issachar was not son number 6, he was son number 5. Issachar is a strong donkey. That's an interesting way to describe your kid, I suppose. Lying down between the sheepfolds when he saw that a resting place was good and that the land was pleasant, he bowed his shoulder to bear burdens and became a slave at forced labor. Now, Issachar's territory was to the south of Zebulun, but not up on the coast. If Issachar had conquered the Gaza Strip as they had been commanded to, Issachar too would have been a coastal tribe. But as it was, they were somewhat inland and sort of southeast of Zebulun's territory. And they were constantly, after they had inherited the promised land, constantly under attack from the Philistines, but never actually made the effort to conquer the Philistines, which is why in verse 15 it says they became a slave at forced labor. They alternated sometimes between being not necessarily slaves, but at least labor for the tribe of Zebulun, but frequently were, I hesitate to use the term enslaved by the Philistines. They allowed, because they didn't make the effort to conquer them, they allowed the Philistines to subjugate them, but not to the point that they became Philistine slaves. It is believed that they were smart enough to actually get rich off of the trading and the goods that they traded back and forth with the Philistines, that the Philistines apparently, rather than just outright enslaving them, apparently utilized them as hired servants, and Issachar was okay with that because they apparently made out fairly well economically and never made the effort to try to do anything about it, because the area of land that they inherited, which later became known as, the northern end of Galilee, it actually was a profitable, fruitful area of the land, which of course is, in verse 15, it even says that he saw that a resting place was good and that the land was pleasant. So they were fine with that. They didn't want to go any further.
Could it be that the reason why Zebulun is placed ahead of Issachar is that the younger brother ends up being the preeminent one and the older brother the subservient one?
Probably. In fact, that
Which is a common theme in here?
pretty much. That because Zebulun as a tribe prospered from a theological perspective much more than Issachar, who was willing to allow themselves to be used as servants. That's part of what Jacob, I think, was illustrating here in this particular, by doing this. Now, in verse 16, it begins with Dan. Now, before I move on to Dan, I want to mention one thing. You'll notice these first 6 tribes, these are all the Leah tribes. Beginning with Dan and all the way down through verse 21, what we have here are the concubine tribes. Those, what's that?
Well, I don't think I'd want to be classified as one of the concubine tribes.
Well, that's what they were. And apparently Jacob treated them as such, because you'll notice he puts Leah's sons up front, describes them, sandwiches the tribes of the 2 concubines in the middle, and then ends up, beginning in verse 22 and down through verse 27, with Rachel's two sons. Starts off with Leah, puts in the 2 concubines, and then finishes up with Rachel. And you'll notice the longest amount of time that Jacob spent describing their inheritance, he spends way more time with Leah's, especially on Judah's, and with Rachel's, again, primarily with Joseph's, and only a verse or two here and there with the ones in the middle, beginning with Dan. Dan gets 3 verses. Gad, 1 verse. Asher, 1 verse. Naphtali, 1 verse. Dan is the only one that gets really any kind of a decent mention at all here, and that's because Dan ended up being the bad boy tribe of the whole bunch. Think there's any theological significance here to the way that Jacob described these? Putting the concubine tribes in the middle and then just kind of giving them a nod, like, yeah, you and you and you. Now let's get back to what's important. You see half a chapter on Leah's, probably about 1/3 of the chapter on Rachel's, and then just this little section about that long on the rest of them, those 4. Why do you suppose that is?
Importance.
Do you think Jacob is still playing favorites with his kids?
Absolutely.
This is one lesson apparently Jacob never did get right. And that may be one of the reasons why these other tribes, they kind of ended up, even in the inheritance, being off in the outskirts of Israel. And throughout a lot of the Israelite history, later on, several hundred years later, barely any mention of them at all. And by the way, which we're fixing to get to in Dan's, in the book of Revelation, where we have another listing of the 12 tribes of Israel, it lists Manasseh and Ephraim. Guess who's, in order to round out the 12, guess who's missing? Dan. All right, well, let's look at verse 16. Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Now, Dan started off, and by the way, the name Dan apparently, linguistically meant that, judge. But he started off, when I say he, I don't just mean Dan as a son, but the tribe. Early on in the history of Israel, right after the conquest of Canaan, they were one of the stronger tribes. And they were noted for being the tribe where, a lot of wisdom came from. That if you wanted to know what to do, get Dan involved in it. They judged the rest of the tribe or the rest of the nation in a sense of being one of the stronger tribes. But that didn't last very long. A couple hundred years, and then Dan began to rebel against the rest of the nation. And you notice in verse 17 it says, Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a horned snake in the path that bites the horse's heels so that his rider falls backwards. For thy salvation I wait, O Lord. Now, by the way, verse 18, a lot of commentators don't believe verse 18 has anything to do with the blessing on Dan at all. That this is Jacob, after he just pronounced Dan to be nothing but a serpent, said, well, he's going to be a judge, but he's going to turn on you and turn into a serpent. And he's going to bite you. And then in verse 18, he just throws in, this, for your salvation I wait. A lot of commentators believe that's Jacob basically rolling his eyes, and this is not a blessing on Dan, but Jacob saying that, can't wait to get out of here. I don't want to talk about Dan anymore. Now,
Interesting also that he's described as biting the horse's heels. The serpent bruises Jesus' heel.
Yep. And Dan is the one that rebelled. And here's where Dan really messed up and why I think Dan is referred to as a serpent. Dan is the one that later on in Israelite history probably got deeper and more involved in idolatry than any of the other tribes. Way more. Dan was, because of their location, they were east of Zebulun.
In the north, right?
In the
Northeast.
north, they were the northernmost tribe, just to the east of Zebulun, right in the central highlands, adjacent to what later became Lebanon, but at that time would have been inland from Tyre, but in an area that going to the north would have been, northeast would have been Syria, to the northwest would have been Tyre, and they were exposed to a lot of pagan influence coming in from the north. And Dan, theologically, was probably one of the most rebellious tribes of the whole nation. And that's one of the reasons it's believed that in the Revelation list of Israelite tribes, Dan is left out because he was one of the ones that was responsible for leading them into idolatry. All right, verse 19. As for Gad, raiders shall raid him, and he shall raid at their heels. Now, I'm not going to try to repeat this in Hebrew, but when he says, as for Gad, and then says raiders, the word raiders or raiding band and he shall raid are all plays on the same Hebrew word of which Gad is the root. So he's basically saying, as for gadders shall gad them, is essentially in Hebrew what he's saying.
You'll be what you are.
You're going to be what you are. And he shall raid at their heels. And it is known that from the time of the conquest of Canaan, from then on, Gad was constantly under threat from invaders. That was what you'll notice in the Babylonian invasion. They were one of the first tribes that went down when Assyria and Babylon both came in and defeated Israel and then later Judah. Gad was constantly being raided. They were constantly known for being the one tribe that quite frequently fought back as long as they could until they finally fell to the Assyrians. But again, just a one-word thing here that must have been really an interesting way to put the blessing. So, well, Gad, gadders are going to be gadding you for the rest of your life. Then verse 20, Asher. As for Asher, his food shall be rich, and he shall yield royal dainties or royal food. The land of Asher later on was known for being basically the bread belt of Israel. It was the most agriculturally productive area of the entire nation. They were in an area, the central part of the Promised Land, and they were primarily farmers that produced the agriculture for the rest of the nation. 21, Naphtali. Naphtali is a doe let loose. He gives beautiful words. Now, there's some question as to the translation of the word that's, in mine is translated words. Anybody have an alternate there?
Mine says words.
You looking it up?
Yeah.
Tell us what you get.
Sure, I'm looking at the right one.
561.
A masculine noun meaning word, speech, saying. The primary meaning is something said. The word is used like another word, debar. However, it occurs only in poetry, usually in the plural, often in the phrase, the words of my mouth. Words are seen as taking from their context qualities such as truth, beauty, deception, knowledge. This word may refer to God's words.
Okay. Well,
So basically, he was a poet.
possibly. There's a lot of speculation, and I'm not going to get into all the.
Were they known for being orators?
Not really. Naphtali basically was one of those small, insignificant tribes that just kind of, after a while, got absorbed by other surrounding tribes. Don't really, nobody really has a good idea as to what Jacob was talking about when he says that, he gives beautiful words, because Naphtali was not known for being the producer of prophets or poets or anything like that. Now, that's of those we know about. Of course, keep in mind that there's a lot of the prophets and, Psalms and what have you in the Bible that we don't know the origin of the individual who wrote. I'm not saying we don't know who wrote it. We don't know what the background was of a lot of those writing prophets and poets that we have in the Bible. Possible Naphtali could have been among those, but I'm not going to sit here and just make up, speculation, because I looked this up in multiple different commentaries and what have you. None of them had a lot to say about what they thought Naphtali was talking about. They really just didn't know for sure. So,
On mine, it says Naphtali is a doe let loose that bears beautiful fawns.
that was the alternative translation. I was kind of wondering if you were going to come up with that.
That wasn't in my definition at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was the other one, that it's either means words or fawns. But if you choose the fawn definition, that makes less sense than the beautiful words. Again, don't know.
Were the daughters of Naphtali known for being excessively beautiful?
Not particularly.
Then that doesn't make sense.
No, don't. So, we'll just keep on. We'll go on into Joseph. We'll spend a little time with him before we call it quits for tonight. All right, beginning in verse 22. And you'll notice now that we've basically skimmed through what I'm sure to Jacob were his less important sons. And I'm sure for those sons that probably thought, well, we might as well leave because we're not important. Now he's just, getting back to the ones that he thinks are important. He gets to Joseph and just goes on and on about him. Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring. Its branches run over a wall. The archers bitterly attacked him. Of course, I think we can figure out what that's talking about. Shot at him and harassed him. That's not too veiled of a reference to his brothers kidnapping him.
But Jacob found out the truth.
Apparently. But his bow remained firm, and his arms were agile from the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. For there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Well, from there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. From the God of your father who helps you, and by the Almighty who blesses you, with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that lies beneath, blessings of the breast and of the womb. He just goes on and on about how blessed Joseph is. You do get the impression at this point he must have at some point found out the truth.
been a number of years. They couldn't
Yeah.
have kept it secret all that time.
No, probably not. Especially once the grandkids got big enough to say, "Grandpa, you know what really happened to Dad? Well, we're going to tell you. The blessings of your father have surpassed the blessings of my ancestors, up to the utmost bound of the everlasting hills. May they be on the head of Joseph, and on the crown of the head of the one distinguished among his brothers." Now, it's interesting that clearly he's patting Joseph on the back for remaining firm in the middle of all of his captivity, being sold into slavery, that he didn't waver, and then, of course, ends up being the prime minister of Egypt. The only thing that I can see on here as to why Jacob probably didn't declare Joseph the royal tribe is if indeed he is speaking prophetically here, God himself probably, directed him as to what he was going to bless them. Because you definitely get the impression from the way he's blessing Joseph that even though he's told Judah that Judah would be the royal tribe, he's just fawning all over Joseph here. And I can't help but wonder the rest of the sons are probably looking at Joseph and thinking, here we go again. Daddy's boy.
It also would appear that if Jacob had been the one making the choice, Joseph would have been the progenitor of the Messianic line.
More
and not
than
Judah.
likely.
That God made that choice, not Jacob.
And the thing to be to consider in favor of that view is Joseph was in fact the firstborn of what Jacob intended to be his only
first
wife,
yeah.
and definitely his favorite wife. And Jacob had already by this point given Joseph the birthright. So yeah, by human wisdom, Joseph definitely would have been the royal tribe. You get the distinct impression that probably only through an utterance of God did Jacob not do that. But then he goes to Benjamin, and kind of in a surprising twist, Benjamin, his baby, and we definitely see from all the things that happened earlier, Benjamin was his baby. He only gives one verse to Benjamin, and the way he describes him is strange. He said, Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he devours the prey, and in the evening he divides the spoil. In other words, he's saying that Benjamin is going to be a warlike tribe. And we do know that later on down the line, Benjamin became the producer of a lot of Israel's finer soldiers. For example, which tribe did Saul come from?
Benjamin.
Benjamin. So Benjamin was known for being a tribe of warriors. And that's the best we can make out. Apparently, Jacob is declaring that Benjamin's going to be the tribe of the soldiers here. Now, verse 28. All these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is what their father said to them when he blessed them. He blessed them, every one with the blessing appropriate to him. Now, looking at that and going back to Naphtali, is this kind of biblically telling, the way that we look at this and say, well, maybe Naphtali was just an unimportant tribe that really didn't amount to anything? If this is the blessing appropriate to Naphtali, and all we have is Naphtali is just a producer of fancy words or a lot of fawns, maybe Naphtali was just, and of course, as we look later on in the tribal history of Israel, did Naphtali really do anything noteworthy? Not really. Not that we know of. Verse 29, then he charged them and said to them, I am about to be gathered to my peoples. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah.
That's where Rachel's buried. Isn't it?
Well, no, that's where Leah was buried.
Leah.
Rachel never made it that far.
Okay.
Rachel died in childbirth before they got that far. So, which is before Mamre in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought along the field from Ephron the Hittite for a burial site. You recall that at this point in history, that really is the only part of all of Canaan that is genuinely their property that they have a deed to. Even the areas that, where Jacob had grazed his cattle and what have you, we have no indication that Jacob ever actually owned any of the land. We know Isaac didn't. Abraham didn't, other than this one field that he wanted to buy from, this Hittite, specifically because he wanted the cave at the north end of the field to bury his wife. There they buried Abraham and his wife Sarah. There they buried Isaac and his wife Rebekah. And there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is in it purchased from the sons of Heth. When Jacob finished charging his sons, he drew his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. Now, last point I'll make on verse 33. That reads in such a way that it almost sounds like Jacob said, okay, here's what I want you to do. Okay, I'm dead now. We don't know how much time there was. The way biblical writers tend to summarize stuff, when it says that he drew his feet in, he may have just kind of, pulled himself back into the bed, laid back. As far as we know, he could have sat there for another month or two. We have no way of knowing. All I'm saying is, don't read this in such a way to think, oh, Jacob issued all of these prophecies and then rolled over and died.
It's kind of like when Forrest Gump would say, and that's all I have to say about that.
That's pretty much. That's all he had to say about that.
Done.
That's all Moses tells us about. But Moses, we really don't have any idea how much time might have elapsed between then and Jacob's actual death. Could have been days, weeks, could have been months. But we know that that's all Moses has to say about that, and that's it. Yes, ma'am.
Well, my King James Version says he breathed his last.
Well, yeah, at the point that he died. But my point is, from the time he finished the prophecy and breathed his last, we don't know how much time that was.
Basically, what Moses is saying is nothing else important happened between these two events.
Yeah.
He completed this task of blessing his children, and then he died. But you don't know how much time passed in between those.
Well, it sure sounds like it was right then.
That's the way it makes it sound, yeah. That's the easiest way to interpret the way it's written.
Well, I'll put it to you this way. Have you ever seen anybody not just conscious, but completely, aware, fully awake, carrying on a conversation, and then just turn around and go, oh, okay. We know it don't happen that way.
It does
Death.
in the Western all the time.
Yeah.
Hollywood!
Yeah, except in Hollywood, death doesn't happen that way, and you and I both know that. All I'm saying is Moses just said the next significant event was Jacob breathed his last. But we don't know how long he may have hung on after that. Could have been days or even weeks.
Could have only been hours.
Could have been hours. But we know, anybody that's ever experienced watching somebody die, which you've had that experience, you know that it doesn't go from A to Z in an hour. It don't happen that way. So unless God orchestrated that, we just don't know how much time that it might have been. And it's really not important. All I'm saying is, don't read into it that he just rolled over and died. That's not what Moses is saying. as Merrill mentioned, Moses' point in all this is his last significant event was to bless his sons, and the next thing of any interest is he died. Question.